In this video, we will explore the lead up to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the consequential retaliation. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back through the decades to a world that feels both distant and strangely familiar. The year is 1941. The 20th century is only 41 years old, and already it has been shaped by forces that no one could have predicted: a great war that scarred an entire generation, an economic collapse that humbled the mightiest nations on earth, and now, once again, the slow, grinding machinery of conflict turning across the globe. But tonight, we begin not with war. We begin with quiet, with the ordinary texture of days that people were simply living, unaware of what was coming. Imagine the Pacific Ocean as it looked from above in those years. An enormous blue expanse, the largest body of water on Earth, stretching so wide that it seemed to belong to its own world entirely. On its eastern edge, the United States of America. On its western edge, the islands and coastlines of Asia. And in the middle, scattered like stepping stones across an impossibly vast sea, the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaii in 1941 was not yet a state. It was a territory, a distant outpost of American life, warm and green and fragrant, where the trade winds moved through the palm trees in the evenings and the mountains rose in great, dark shapes against the sky. The island of Oahu, the most populous of the chain, was home to the city of Honolulu, a busy, sun-warmed port town full of sailors and shopkeepers, musicians and merchants, the streets humming with a particular energy of a place that knows it sits at a crossroads. And on the southwestern shore of Oahu, nestled between the mountains and the sea, was Pearl Harbor, a wide, sheltered anchorage of still water, a natural harbor so perfect that the United States Navy had made it the home of its Pacific Fleet. Great gray ships rested there at anchor, their hulls reflected in the calm water. Battleships with names that carried a kind of weight: the Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia. Names that would soon mean something very different from what they meant now. For the moment, they were simply ships, resting, waiting, their crews going about the steady, ordinary business of naval life. To understand what happened at Pearl Harbor, we must first understand the world that made it possible. And that world had been building toward crisis for a very long time. In Europe, the war that would come to be called the Second World War had already been burning for 2 years. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had swept across the continent with shocking speed. Poland had fallen in weeks. France had surrendered in the summer of 1940 after only 6 weeks of fighting a collapse that stunned the world. Britain stood alone, battered by the German Air Force night after night, her cities burning, her people exhausted but unbowed. The United States watched all of this with deep unease, and also, in many quarters, with a fierce desire to stay out of it. The memory of the First World War was still alive in the minds of millions of Americans. The trenches, the mud, the enormous, heartbreaking loss of young men sent across the ocean to fight in someone else's conflict. There was a powerful feeling in the country, a feeling that had a name: isolationism. The belief that America should tend to its own affairs and let the rest of the world sort itself out. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the danger in Europe. He believed deeply that an Axis victory would ultimately threaten America. But he also understood his country. He could not simply lead the American people into a war they did not want. And so he moved carefully, supporting Britain with supplies and ships, lending aid through a program called Lend-Lease, inching the country closer to involvement without quite crossing the threshold. It was a delicate, difficult balance, and it was about to be broken not from the direction of Europe, but from a quarter that many Americans had not been watching closely enough. Turn your attention now to Japan, a nation of islands on the far western edge of the Pacific. In the early decades of the 20th century, Japan had been transforming itself with extraordinary speed and ambition from a feudal society largely closed to the outside world into a modern industrial power with imperial ambitions of its own. Japan looked at Asia and saw resources: oil, rubber, iron, the raw materials that a growing industrial nation needed, and that Japan's own islands could not provide in sufficient quantities. It looked at the European colonial empires, the Dutch in the East Indies, the French in Indochina, the British in Malaya, and it saw an opportunity. With Europe distracted and bleeding, the vast territories of Southeast Asia lay vulnerable. But to reach those territories, to secure those resources, Japan believed it needed to act boldly, and it needed to remove the one power that might stand in its way. That power was the United States. More specifically, it was the United States Navy. And more specifically still, it was a fleet of great gray warships resting quietly in the sheltered waters of Pearl Harbor. The relationship between the United States and Japan had been deteriorating for years. The two countries had once been on relatively cordial terms. But Japan's invasion of China in 1937 had horrified many Americans. Images of the destruction, particularly the brutal campaign at Nanjing, where Japanese forces committed atrocities that shocked the conscience of the world, had hardened American opinion against Japan's imperial ambitions. The Roosevelt administration responded with economic pressure. Gradually, and then more severely, the United States restricted the sale of oil and metal to Japan. In the summer of 1941, after Japan moved into southern Indochina, America froze Japanese assets and imposed a near-total oil embargo. For Japan, this was an existential crisis. The country imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. Without that oil, its military machine would grind to a halt within 2 years. Its ships would sit still. Its planes would not fly. Its empire would wither. Japan's leaders faced a choice, and it was, in many ways, a terrible one. They could retreat. They could withdraw from China, from Indochina, abandon the vision of an Asian empire, and accept American terms. Some voices in Tokyo urged exactly this. The cost of war with the United States, they argued, would be catastrophic. But the dominant voices in the Japanese military and government saw it differently. They believed that retreat would mean humiliation and the end of Japan's status as a great power. And they believed, perhaps with a mixture of hope and self-deception, that a swift, decisive blow against the American fleet might force the United States into a negotiated peace, buying Japan the time and space to consolidate its gains in Asia. It was a gamble of breathtaking proportions, and at the center of that gamble was a plan that one man had been quietly developing for months. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet, a small, compact man with a precise, mathematical mind, and an unusual background for a Japanese admiral of his era. He had spent time in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He spoke English. He had seen America's industrial capacity with his own eyes, and he understood, better than almost anyone in the Japanese high command, what a war with the United States would ultimately mean. And yet, he had developed a plan anyway. He called it, in its early form, a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a mass aerial assault launched from aircraft carriers in the quiet hours of a Sunday morning when the fleet would be at anchor and the men would be sleeping. He had proposed it, argued for it, fought for it against considerable opposition within the Navy, and eventually he had won the argument. The plan was approved. Take a slow, deep breath now. Outside, somewhere, the world is quiet. The night is doing what nights do, holding everything still, giving the day a chance to rest. And in our story, it is still 1941. The wheels have been set in motion, but they are turning slowly, invisibly. In Hawaii, The palm trees are swaying in the trade winds. In Washington, diplomats are still talking. In Tokyo, preparations are underway in secret. And the ships at Pearl Harbor are resting on still water, their running lights reflected softly on the surface of the harbor, the men aboard them dreaming of home. We will return to this story in the next segment, moving closer to that December morning and the events that would change everything. For now, let yourself rest. Let the images settle gently the wide blue Pacific, the green mountains of Oahu, the gray ships at anchor. There is more to come. But for now, simply breathe and let the story hold you as you drift toward sleep. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in the city of Nagaka in northern Japan, a place that knew something about defeat. Nagaka had backed the losing side in Japan's Great Civil War of 1868, and the city carried that memory with a particular kind of quiet pride, a culture of perseverance in the face of adversity. It was not a bad place to grow up if you were going to spend your life in the military. He was adopted into the Yamamoto family as a young man, a common practice in Japan at the time, when families without male heirs would take in promising young men to carry the family name forward. He joined the Naval Academy at 16, and from the beginning he showed the qualities that would define him: a sharp, analytical mind, an almost reckless physical courage, and an unusual willingness to question received wisdom. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, one of the great naval battles of the early 20th century, in which the Japanese fleet destroyed the Russian Imperial Navy in a stunning engagement in the waters between Japan and Korea. He was 20 years old. He carried those missing fingers for the rest of his life as a reminder, perhaps, of what naval warfare actually cost. In the years that followed, he rose steadily through the ranks. He became an aviator. He became convinced, earlier than most of his contemporaries, that the age of the great battleship was ending, that the future of naval warfare belonged to the aircraft carrier, to planes launched from the sea, striking targets far beyond the horizon. This was not a popular view among men who had built their careers and their sense of identity around the massive, magnificent battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But Yamamoto held to it, argued for it, and eventually saw his ideas shape the direction of Japanese naval doctrine. It was this conviction that air power launched from carriers could be decisive that led him, in the spring of 1940, to begin thinking seriously about Pearl Harbor. The idea itself was not entirely new. War games and theoretical exercises had occasionally touched on the possibility of an attack on Hawaii. But Yamamoto was the first to treat it as a serious operational objective, to insist that it be planned in detail, to push it through the bureaucratic resistance of the Naval General Staff. His logic was straightforward, even if the plan it led to was anything but. Japan needed to move south, into the Dutch East Indies, into Malaya, into the Philippines to seize the oil and rubber and tin that its empire required. But the American Pacific Fleet sat at Pearl Harbor, within striking distance of those operations. If Japan moved south and left the fleet intact, the Americans could intervene at a moment of their choosing, cutting off Japanese supply lines, threatening Japanese forces from the east. The fleet had to be neutralized. The options were limited. A naval blockade was not realistic. An invasion of Hawaii was beyond Japan's capacity. That left a surprise attack, a single massive strike that would destroy or cripple the fleet at anchor before it could respond, buying Japan the months it needed to consolidate its position in Southeast Asia. Yamamoto's hope, and he was honest about the fact that it was a hope rather than a certainty, was that such a blow would shock the United States into seeking negotiated settlement rather than committing to a long and costly Pacific War. He knew America's industrial power. He had seen it. He doubted that Japan could win a prolonged conflict. But perhaps, if the blow was hard enough, the Americans would decide that the cost of revenge was too high. It was, as history would show, a profound miscalculation of American psychology. But it was not an irrational plan. Given Japan's constraints, given the resources it needed, given the threat that the Pacific Fleet represented, the plan had a cold, hard logic to it. Through the summer and autumn of 1941, the planning intensified. The man tasked with turning the concept into an operational reality was a vice admiral named Chuichi Nagumo, a cautious, somewhat reluctant commander who had his doubts about the mission, but who threw himself into its preparation with professional thoroughness. Under him, a team of planners worked through the countless difficulties the operation presented. The first problem was range. Pearl Harbor was roughly 3,500 miles from Japan. No strike force could simply sail there. It would be spotted, reported, and the element of surprise would be lost. The attack needed to approach from the north, through some of the roughest, most remote waters in the Pacific, where the chances of being observed by merchant ships or fishing vessels were minimized. The second problem was depth. Pearl Harbor was a shallow anchorage, in many places less than 40 feet deep. Standard aerial torpedoes, dropped from planes, would plunge deep into the water before leveling off. In a harbor as shallow as Pearl, they would simply bury themselves in the mud before they reached their targets. Japanese engineers spent months redesigning the torpedoes, fitting them with wooden stabilizing fins that allowed them to run shallow. It was painstaking, frustrating work. But eventually, they made it work. The third problem was armor. The American battleships were heavily protected. Conventional bombs dropped from high altitude were unlikely to penetrate their armored decks. The answer, worked out by a team of ordnance specialists, was to convert large-caliber naval shells designed to be fired from battleships into aerial bombs, fitted with fins and dropped from high altitude. The mass and density of a battleship shell, falling from several thousand feet, could penetrate armor that a conventional bomb could not. Every problem had a solution. The solutions created new problems. Those problems were solved in turn. The plan grew more detailed, more refined, more audacious with every passing week. And then there was the training. Through the late summer and into the autumn of 1941, Japanese pilots practiced their attacks over and over again in Kagoshima Bay on the southern island of Kyushu. The bay had been chosen because its geography, a city on the shoreline, mountains rising behind it, a shallow, enclosed anchorage resembled Pearl Harbor closely enough to serve as a substitute. The pilots flew low over the rooftops of the city. They practiced dropping their modified torpedoes into shallow water. They studied maps and photographs of Pearl Harbor until they could navigate its channels from memory. They were not told, at first, exactly what they were training for, but they understood that they were being prepared for something significant. The men who would fly on December 7th were among the most skilled naval aviators in the world. Japan had been fighting in China for years, and many of its pilots had accumulated hundreds of combat hours. They were confident, they were well-trained, and they had no idea whether they would be coming home. By October 1941, the operation had been given a name, Operations as a reference to the famous Z flag that Admiral Togo had flown at the Battle of Tsushima, the flag that signaled to the Japanese fleet that the fate of the empire rested on what they were about to do. The same words, some felt, applied now. On November 26, 1941, a date that would later take on enormous significance, the strike force assembled in Hitokepu Bay, a remote, fog-shrouded anchorage in the Kuril Islands, far to the north of the Japanese mainland. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers to refuel the fleet at sea, and 23 submarines are already moving ahead of the main force, spreading out across the Pacific approaches to Hawaii. In total, the force carried more than 400 aircraft. It was the largest carrier strike force ever assembled in history. On the morning of November 26, the fleet weighed anchor and slipped out of Hitokepu Bay into the gray North Pacific, maintaining strict radio silence. running without lights at night, choosing a route through the empty latitudes of the Northern Ocean where the storms and the fog would help conceal them. They were heading east, toward Hawaii, toward Pearl Harbor, and they had not been seen. Back in Washington, American diplomats were still talking to their Japanese counterparts. The conversations had been going on for months with careful, formal exchanges about trade and territory and the possibility of some arrangement that might pull the two countries back from the edge. The Americans were not optimistic. Intelligence analysts had been watching Japanese military movements with increasing alarm. It was clear that Japan was preparing to move somewhere. Intercepted Japanese communications decoded through a program called MAGIC had given American officials a general sense that war was coming. Warnings had been sent to American commanders in the Pacific, including the commander at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel, and the Army commander in Hawaii, General Walter Short. The warnings were real. They were genuine, but they were also vague. They spoke of a likely attack on American interests in Southeast Asia, on the Philippines, on Malaya, on Guam. The possibility that Japan might strike directly at Pearl Harbor, at the heart of the American fleet on American soil, seemed to many people in Washington and in Hawaii almost too bold to be credible. And so the great ships rested at anchor, and the men went about their weekends. And the Japanese fleet moved steadily eastward through the cold gray swells of the North Pacific, unseen and unsuspected. 12 days. That was how long it would take to cross the ocean. 12 days, and then the world would change. Because that, perhaps, is the most quietly heartbreaking part of this story. Not just what happened, but the ordinary life that existed right up until the moment it was interrupted. The Saturday errands and the Sunday sleep-ins, the letters home and the baseball scores and the smell of breakfast being made in the galley of a ship at anchor on a calm Hawaiian morning. History, when we look back at it, can feel inevitable. We know how it ends, and so the steps leading toward the ending seem like they could only ever have gone one way. But the people living through those steps did not know. They woke up each morning into an open future. And on the morning of December 6, 1941, the last ordinary Saturday, that future still felt, to most of the people in Hawaii, like something peaceful. Let us spend some time in Honolulu on that Saturday. The city was busy in the particular way that port cities near military bases tend to be busy on weekends. Sailors from the fleet had come ashore on Liberty-free time, a chance to breathe air that wasn't tinged with oil and salt water, a chance to eat something other than mess hall food. The bars and restaurants along Hotel Street were filling up. The cinemas were showing their evening programs. Somewhere in the city a band was playing, the music drifting out through open doors into the warm Hawaiian night. The USS Arizona, one of the great battleships moored along what was known as Battleship Row on the eastern side of Ford Island in the middle of the harbor, had hosted a band competition that afternoon. Several of the Navy's ships fielded musical bands, and competitions between them were a point of considerable pride. The Arizona's band had competed and, by most accounts, played beautifully. They returned to the ship that evening, tired and happy, instruments packed away. Most of them would be dead before the next afternoon. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, even gently, even softly, not to dwell on it with horror, but simply to feel the weight of it, the terrible proximity of ordinary joy and catastrophic loss. The band playing, the music carrying across the water, and the fleet to the north, still hours away but drawing closer with every turn of its propellers. On the American side, there was unease, but unease is a long way from certainty. In Washington, the diplomatic conversations with Japan had effectively broken down. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had met with Japanese envoys just days earlier and delivered a note that amounted to an ultimatum Japan must withdraw from China and Indochina, renounce its alliance with Germany and Italy, and accept American terms. The Japanese government had already decided, before the note was even delivered, that negotiations were finished. The fleet was already at sea. American military intelligence knew that something was coming. The Japanese diplomatic traffic, decoded through the magic program, was becoming increasingly ominous. On December 6, analysts began receiving portions of a long Japanese message, 14 parts in total being sent to the Japanese embassy in Washington. The message was clearly a formal rejection of Hull's note. It read like a prelude to war. President Roosevelt, reading an early intercept that evening, turned to his aide Harry Hopkins and said, quietly, that it looked as though war was coming. Hopkins agreed. They talked for a short while about the situation, the impossibility of it, the weight of what seemed to be approaching. Then Roosevelt went to bed. In Hawaii, Admiral Kimmel and General Short had received their warning from Washington. They had taken precautions, but not the right ones, as it turned out, and not enough of them. Short, worried about sabotage from Japanese residents in Hawaii, had ordered his aircraft parked close together on the airfields, wingtip to wingtip, where they would be easier to guard. It was a reasonable precaution against one threat, and it would make them catastrophically vulnerable to another. Kimmel had positioned his fleet in the harbor over the weekend rather than sending ships to sea, a routine practice. He had no particular reason to believe Pearl Harbor itself was a target. Both men would spend the rest of their lives living with the decisions they made in those days. Both were relieved of their commands in the aftermath of the attack. Whether they deserved the blame that was heaped upon them is a question that historians have debated ever since. Meanwhile, in the North Pacific, the fleet had arrived. After 12 days at sea, 12 days of fog and cold and rolling swells, of strict radio silence and blacked-out ships and careful, anxious navigation, the strike force had reached its launch point, a position roughly 230 miles north of Oahu. Close enough to launch. Far enough, the planners hoped, to remain undetected. It was the evening of December 6. The sea was running with moderate swells. The sky was overcast. On the flight decks of the 6 carriers, the aircraft had been brought up from below and were being prepared, fueled, armed, their engines checked and rechecked by mechanics working in the darkness. Pilots had been briefed and rebriefed. Attack assignments had been reviewed until every man knew his target and his approach. Commander Mitsu Fukaida, the lead strike commander, the man who would fly at the head of the first wave and whose voice would broadcast a signal for the attack, walked the flight deck that evening, looking at the planes lined up in the dark. He had been planning for this for months. He had trained for it. He believed in it. Whether he slept that night, history does not clearly record. But in the early hours of December 7th, well before dawn, he and the other pilots were woken and given a final meal. Some of them tied ceremonial headbands around their foreheads. Some wrote letters. Some simply sat quietly with their thoughts, in the way that people do when they are about to do something from which there is no returning. At Pearl Harbor, the night had been quiet. The officer of the deck on the USS Nevada, one of the battleships moored along Battleship Row, noted in the log that conditions were calm. The harbor lights were reflected on still water. A light breeze came in off the mountains. Somewhere ashore, a dog was barking at something in the darkness, and then fell silent. At a few minutes before 4 in the morning, the minesweeper USS Condor was making a routine patrol at the entrance to Pearl Harbor when its watch officer spotted something in the water. A small shape, moving, a periscope, he thought. He sent a signal to the destroyer USS Ward, which was on patrol nearby. The Ward's commander took the report seriously. His crew searched the area. They found nothing immediately. The hours passed. Dawn began to lighten the sky in the east. And then, just before 7 in the morning, the Ward found what it was looking for: a small submarine, a midget submarine, trying to follow a supply ship through the harbor entrance. The Ward's commander did not hesitate. He ordered his crew to open fire. The submarine was hit. Depth charges were dropped. A contact report was sent to Naval Headquarters. It was the first shot of what would become America's war in the Pacific, fired by an American destroyer at a Japanese submarine 40 minutes before the planes arrived. The contact report reached Naval Headquarters in Hawaii. It was passed along, but the machinery of decision, the phone calls, the assessments, the verification moved slowly. It was Sunday morning. It was early. The report was noted, but its significance was not grasped in time. At 6:10 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off the carrier decks into the pre-dawn darkness. 183 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, high-level bombers, fighters who escort them and suppress any American air response. They climbed to altitude, formed up in the darkness, and turned south toward Oahu, toward the sleeping harbor, toward the gray ships at anchor that Yamamoto's planners had memorized from maps and photographs. Fukaida flew at the lead. Below him, the clouds parted as Oahu came into view, the green mountains, the red earth, the silver glint of the harbor in the early morning light. Everything exactly as the maps had shown. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. He would later write that the sight of it, the island emerging from the clouds, peaceful and unaware, on that clear December morning struck him with a feeling he found difficult to describe. Not triumph. Not exactly. Something more complicated than that. He reached for his radio. 2 words, 2 short syllables that would echo down through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code phrase that told the fleet, told Nagumo on his flagship, told the commanders waiting anxiously at their radios that complete surprise had been achieved. It was 7:49 in the morning, Hawaiian time, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. The attack had begun, but we will not follow the planes down yet. Not quite yet, because there is one more small story to tell, one that happened in those final minutes before the attack, a story that is sometimes forgotten in the larger drama, but which carries its own quiet, melancholy significance. At a radar station on the northern tip of Oahu, on a hilltop called Opana Point, 2 young Army privates were sitting at their mobile radar set, Private Joseph Lorchard and Private George Elliott. They were supposed to finish their shift at 7, but their transport was late arriving. Elliott, who was still learning how to operate the radar equipment, suggested they keep the set running while they waited, good practice. And at 7:02 in the morning, the screen lit up with the largest return either of them had ever seen. A massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north, 132 miles out, and closing. Lorchard called it in to the information center at Fort Shafter. A duty officer named Lieutenant Kermit Tyler took the call. Tyler had been briefed loosely, insufficiently, that a flight of American B-17 bombers was expected to arrive that morning from the mainland. He told Lorchard, calmly, not to worry about it. Don't worry about it. Lorchard and Elliott watched the blip on the screen as it moved steadily toward the island. They tracked it until it was too close for the radar to distinguish it from ground clutter, until it had merged with the land return of Oahu itself. Then they waited for their transport and talked about breakfast, and the morning went quiet again. What happened at Pearl Harbour on the morning of December 7th, 1941 was violent and terrifying and deeply tragic. Many people died. Many more were wounded, burned, or left with memories that never entirely healed. We will not look away from that, but we will hold it gently the way you hold any difficult truth that deserves to be remembered, with respect for the people who lived it, with the understanding that behind every number, every statistic, every ship's name, there was a person, someone's son, someone's husband, someone who had been young and alive and full of the ordinary hopes that people carry without thinking about them, until suddenly they are gone. So, let us go to Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning at 7:55 in the morning, Hawaiian time, December 7th, 1941. The first thing most people noticed was a sound, not an explosion, not yet, just a sound, a deep, growing hum from somewhere to the north, a sound that didn't belong to Sunday morning, that didn't fit the texture of the day. Men on the decks of ships looked up. Men in the barracks stirred and turned over and tried to go back to sleep. A few people looked out of windows, or stepped out of doorways, or shielded their eyes against the early morning sun and looked toward the mountains. And then the planes came over the ridge. Low, impossibly low, it seemed to the people watching. Close enough to see the red circles on their wings, the rising sun insignia of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Close enough, some men would later say, to see the faces of the pilots looking down. For a fraction of a second, maybe longer, there was confusion rather than fear. Military exercises were not uncommon in Hawaii. There had been drills. There had been maneuvers. Some men, in those first moments, assumed this was one of them, an unannounced exercise. Someone in Washington trying to test readiness. Then the torpedoes hit the water. The torpedo bombers came in from the west, skimming low over the harbor entrance and across the water toward Battleship Row, the line of great gray ships moored along the eastern shore of Ford Island, 2 by 2, nested together like sleeping giants. They flew so low that the spray from the harbor surface flecked their windscreens. The modified torpedoes, with their wooden stabilizing fins, ran shallow and true. They had been designed for exactly this. They had been tested and retested and refined over months of painstaking work. And on this morning, they performed as intended. The first explosions came at 7:57. The USS Oklahoma was hit almost immediately by torpedoes striking her port side in rapid succession, tearing open her hull below the waterline. She began to list almost at once. Within 12 minutes of the first strike, she had rolled completely over, her hull rising out of the water, her mast resting on the mud of the harbor bottom. Of a crew of more than 1,000 men, nearly 400 would not survive. The West Virginia was hit by 6 or 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. She settled to the harbor bottom slowly enough that her crew had time to fight the flooding, to counterflood compartments and keep her from rolling as the Oklahoma had. Her captain, Mervyn Benyon, stood on his bridge directing his crew until he was mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb that struck the nearby Tennessee. He refused to be moved. He stayed at his post until he could no longer speak. The Nevada, the ship whose watch officer had noted the calm in his log just a few hours earlier, was struck by a torpedo early in the attack, but she was the only battleship to get underway during the raid. Her crew fought the flooding and managed to start her engines and ease her away from Battleship Row, moving slowly toward the harbor entrance. Japanese dive bombers immediately concentrated on her. A ship underway in the channel was a potential blockage if she sank in the wrong place. She was hit multiple times. Her captain eventually beached her deliberately to prevent exactly that. She was badly damaged, but she had moved. She had tried. Decades later, people who were there still spoke of the Nevada getting underway with a particular motion, as if the ship itself had decided to fight back, and that decision meant something. The high-level bombers came in above the torpedo planes, in tight formation, dropping their converted battleship shells from thousands of feet. These were the ones that posed the greatest danger to the armored decks of the American ships. At 8:06 in the morning, one of those bombs, possibly more than one, penetrated the forward deck of the USS Arizona and reached her forward ammunition magazine. What happened next was instantaneous and total. The Arizona's magazine contained more than 1,000,000 pounds of black powder. When it ignited, the explosion was visible from miles away. A column of fire rose hundreds of feet into the sky. The forward section of the ship was destroyed in a fraction of a second. The shock wave was felt across the harbor. The fireball rose and spread, and then the ship began to sink, still burning a fire so intense that it would not be fully extinguished for 2 days. Of the Arizona's crew of nearly 1,500 men, 1,177 were killed, most of them in that single, instantaneous moment. More than 900 of them are still there, their remains entombed in the wreck, which still rests on the bottom of Pearl Harbor today, still slowly leaching oil into the water, a slow seepage that had continued for more than 80 years, which some have called the ship's tase. The Arizona's band of musicians who had competed just the previous afternoon and returned to the ship happy and tired were lost almost entirely. 20 of the band's 21 members died that morning. While the battleships burned, the Japanese fighters swept across the airfields. At Wheeler Field, in the center of Oahu, and at Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, American aircraft were lined up in neat rows on the tarmac parked close together, wingtip to wingtip, precisely as General Short had ordered to guard against sabotage. The Japanese pilots found them exactly where they had hoped. Wave after wave of Zero Japan's highly maneuverable fighter aircraft strafed the flight lines, setting planes on fire, destroying them before their pilots could even reach them. At some fields, American pilots ran to their planes anyway. A handful managed to get airborne. A small number of American fighters, perhaps a dozen or so over the course of the whole attack, managed to engage the Japanese planes, accounting for perhaps 10 or 11 Japanese aircraft shot down by American pilots. These men flew into an overwhelming force, knowing what they were flying into. A few of them were barely out of training. They went anyway. Their names deserve to be remembered, even if most of them are not widely known. They were very young, and they were very brave, and they were almost completely alone up there in the sky above a burning harbor. The attack came in 2 waves. The first wave lasted approximately 35 minutes from the first torpedo strikes just before 8 o'clock until around 8:30. Then there was a brief lull, a strange and terrible quiet, as the first wave climbed away and the smoke rose from the burning ships and the men on the ground tried to understand what had happened and what might be coming next. The second wave arrived at around 8:40. 170 planes, dive bombers primarily, this time targeting the ships that had survived the first wave and hitting the airfields again and going after the harbor facilities and dry docks. The second wave faced more resistance than the first. Anti-aircraft guns were manned now. Ammunition was being passed up. Men who had spent the first wave in shock were responding, fighting back. The second wave lost more planes than the first. By 9:45 in the morning, it was over. The Japanese planes turned north and flew back toward their carriers. Below them, Pearl Harbor was a scene of devastation. Ships sinking or sunk, ships burning, the oil from ruptured fuel tanks spreading across the harbor surface and catching fire, great columns of black smoke rising into the blue Hawaiian sky. In the silence that followed, the work of survival began. Men trapped inside capsized ships tapped on the hull, a sound that rescue crews could sometimes hear, faint and desperate, from outside. The Oklahoma and other capsized vessels became the site of frantic rescue operations that would last for days. Workers with cutting torches moved along the hull, listening, cutting through the steel when they heard tapping, pulling men out through holes cut in the ship's side. 32 men were rescued from inside Oklahoma. Others, deep in the ship, in flooded compartments, could not be reached in time. In the water of the harbor, men swam through oil-thick black, choking oil from the ruptured bunkers of the battleships. Some of it was on fire. Men swam through burning oil, or tried to go around it, or were pulled down by it. Small boats moved through the harbor, pulling survivors from the water. Hospital ships filled quickly. The naval hospital and nearby civilian hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, doctors and nurses working without pause through the morning and into the afternoon and evening. Across the island, in the hours after the attack, there was fear that the Japanese might return. Our land troops, or come back in force. Soldiers were sent to defensive positions along the beaches. Barbed wire was strung. Roads were blocked. Civilians were told to stay indoors, to tape their windows, to prepare for the possibility of more. The uncertainty was, in some ways, its own kind of ordeal. No one knew if it was over. No one knew what was coming next. Let's pause here for a moment and simply acknowledge the scale of what had happened. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese strike force had sunk or badly damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and a number of other vessels. 168 American aircraft had been destroyed, most of them on the ground. 2,403 Americans had been killed. Nearly 1,200 more were wounded. It was, by any measure, a devastating blow. The largest attack on American soil since the War of 1812. The most destructive single military operation ever carried out against the United States. And yet, and this would become clear only in the days and weeks and months that followed, the attack had not achieved everything its planners had intended. The aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were not in harbor that morning. The Lexington and the Enterprise were at sea on separate missions. The Saratoga was on the west coast of the United States undergoing repairs. Yamamoto's planners had hoped to catch the carriers. They had not. The oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbour, enormous above-ground tanks containing millions of gallons of fuel, were not attacked. If they had been destroyed, the Pacific Fleet's ability to operate from Hawaii would have been crippled for months. They stood untouched. The dry docks and repair facilities were largely intact, and most of the battleships that had been sunk or damaged were in relatively shallow water, shallow enough that they could be, and largely would be, raised and repaired. Of the 8 battleships damaged that morning, 6 would eventually return to service. The Arizona could not be saved. The Oklahoma was raised but deemed too damaged to repair and was never returned to service. The Japanese strike had been tactically brilliant and strategically incomplete. Nagumo had chosen not to launch a third wave, a decision that would be debated and second-guessed for the rest of the war. A third wave, targeting the fuel tanks and the repair facilities, might have changed the course of the Pacific War significantly. But he had not known for certain where the carriers were. His planes had been in the air for a long time. He was concerned about losses. He turned his fleet north and headed home. Breathe slowly. Feel, if you can, the enormous distance between that morning and this one. 80-some years. Generations. The world that existed on December 6, 1941 is as remote from us now as the American Civil War was from the men and women who lived through Pearl Harbor. And yet, there is something about this story that does not feel entirely distant. The ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. The failures of imagination that allowed disaster to arrive unannounced. The courage that appeared, not in spite of chaos and terror, but right in the middle of it, in the men who swam through burning oil to reach their ships, in the pilots who flew into impossible odds, in the nurses and doctors who worked without stopping, in the rescue workers who listened for tapping on the hulls of sunken ships. Those people were not heroes in the way that stories usually make heroes. They were ordinary people, young men who had joined the Navy to see the world or on a steady wage, women who had trained as nurses without imagining they would one day be working in a wartime hospital, mechanics and cooks and radio operators and musicians who found themselves suddenly at the center of history. They did what they could. Most of them. They did more than anyone could have asked. Tomorrow, in our story, we will follow the aftermath, the declaration of war, the reckoning with what had happened, and the long road that the attack set in motion. A road that would lead across 4 more years of war, to the far corners of the Pacific, and eventually to an ending that no one standing on the burning docks of Pearl Harbor that Sunday morning could have foreseen. The news reached the American mainland in pieces. Radio was a medium of the age. Television was in its infancy, and most American households gathered around a radio set the way a later generation would gather around a television. On Sunday morning, December 7th, regular programming was interrupted across the country. Music stopped mid-song. Sports broadcasts fell silent. Announcers, their voices careful and controlled in the way that people's voices become when they are delivering news they can barely believe themselves, told their listeners what had happened. Pearl Harbour, Hawaii, the Pacific Fleet, Japanese aircraft. Across the country, people stopped what they were doing. In living rooms and diners and church halls and college dormitories, people turned to their radios and listened. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Some felt a strange, cold clarity, the feeling that arrives sometimes when something long feared finally happens, when uncertainty collapses into terrible certainty. In New York City, crowds gathered in Times Square around loudspeakers and news tickers. In small towns across the Midwest, families huddled around kitchen table radios, the Sunday roast going cold on the counter. On college campuses, young men, the same young men who, the day before, had been debating whether America should get involved in the war, it all began, quietly, to think about enlisting. The isolationist debate, which had consumed American political life for years, effectively ended that afternoon. The question of whether America should enter the war had been answered not by politicians or newspapers or presidential persuasion, but by 2 hours of Japanese bombs and torpedoes on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. President Roosevelt spent the afternoon of December 7th in a series of urgent meetings at the White House. The picture that emerged through those hours was deeply alarming. Pearl Harbor was not the only place that had been struck. In the hours around the attack, Japanese forces had also hit the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Malaya. The assault was not a single blow, it was the opening of an enormous, coordinated offensive across the entire Western Pacific. Japan was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, with a speed and confidence that suggested months of meticulous planning. Roosevelt was, by many accounts, calm in those hours, a particular calm of a man who has been dreading something for a long time and finds, when it arrives, that he knows what to do. He met with his cabinet. He met with congressional leaders from both parties. He dictated and revised the address he would deliver to Congress the following day. That address is one of the most famous speeches in American history, and it was written in a single evening under extraordinary pressure. Roosevelt's original draft was longer and more elaborate, a full account of Japanese provocation stretching back years. His advisers urged him to cut it down. What remained, when he was finished, was precise and direct and devastating in its simplicity. He worked on it through the evening. Outside the White House, a small crowd had gathered in the darkness, standing vigil in Lafayette Square. Inside, the machinery of government was moving with a speed and purpose it had not shown for years. Monday morning, December 8th, Roosevelt was driven to the Capitol to address a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed, every seat filled, members of both houses crowded together, the galleries full. The justices of the Supreme Court were there. The cabinet was there. The diplomatic corps was there. The atmosphere was unlike anything most of the people present had experienced in their careers, a combination of fury and grief and grim resolve that was almost physical in its intensity. Roosevelt entered the chamber on the arm of his son James. He had been paralyzed from the waist down by polio for 20 years and walked with great difficulty, a fact that was largely kept from the public at the time and would seem almost incomprehensible in the media environment of a later era. He moved to the podium slowly. He placed a prepared text before him. He looked out at the chamber, and then he spoke. He began with a date, just a date and a judgment. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire Japan. The speech was 6 minutes and 30 seconds long. It was measured and controlled and precise, a prosecutorial document more than an emotional appeal, laying out the facts, naming the places, making the case. And at its end, Roosevelt asked Congress to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and the Empire of Japan. The vote was taken within the hour. In the Senate, the result was unanimous, 82 to 0. In the House of Representatives, the result was 438 to 1. The single dissenting vote came from Jeannette Rankin of Montana, a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against American entry into the First World War. She would later say that she could not bring herself to vote for any war under any circumstances. She received death threats for her vote. History has treated her with more complexity than her contemporaries did. America was at war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their alliance with Japan, and sparing Roosevelt the politically difficult task of asking Congress to declare war on the European Axis powers first. Hitler's decision to declare war on America is one of the more puzzling strategic choices of the entire conflict, and historians have debated his reasoning ever since. Whatever his logic, the effect was to simplify America's strategic situation considerably. The country was now formally at war on both sides of the world. The arsenal of democracy, a phrase Roosevelt had used the previous year to describe what he hoped America could be for the Allied cause, was about to become something more direct than an arsenal. It was about to become a combatant. In the days that followed the attack, the mood across America was a complicated mixture of emotions that did not always sit easily together. There was grief. Deep, genuine grief for the men lost at Pearl Harbour, for the families who were receiving telegrams in those first terrible days, for the country's sense of safety and separateness from the world's conflicts, which had been so violently dismantled. There was anger, an enormous, burning anger directed at Japan, and, it must be said honestly, an anger that was not always carefully targeted. In the days and weeks after Pearl Harbour, Japanese Americans, many of them born in the United States, American citizens, people whose families had lived in the country for generations, found themselves suddenly regarded with suspicion and fear by their neighbors and their government. That suspicion would lead, within a few months, to one of the most painful episodes in American domestic history. But that story belongs to a later segment. There was also, alongside the grief and the anger, something that many people who lived through those days described as a sense of unity. A feeling perhaps partly real and partly mythologized in the retelling that the country had been jolted out of its divisions and its debates and its hesitations and had arrived, all at once, at a shared purpose. The isolationists and the interventionists, the Republicans and the Democrats, the rich and the poor and the young men lining up at recruiting stations in every city and town in the country were all suddenly pointed in the same direction. Whether that unity was as complete as the memory of it suggests is a question worth holding gently. America in 1941 was a deeply divided country in ways that did not simply dissolve because of Pearl Harbour. The racial segregation of American society did not end. The inequalities that had defined the Depression years did not vanish. Black Americans who volunteered to serve in the military, and they did, in enormous numbers, would find themselves serving in the segregated armed forces, fighting for a democracy that did not yet fully extend to them. History is rarely as simple as its most comforting version. But the energy of those first weeks, the surge of volunteering, the retooling of factories, the collective turning toward a common task was real. Whatever its complications, it was real. At Pearl Harbour itself, the work of recovery had begun almost before the smoke cleared. Admiral Chester Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet on December 17th, 10 days after the attack. He flew to Hawaii and was taken by boat through the harbor past the sunken ships, the debris, the oil still spreading on the water, the Arizona still burning in the distance. He was asked, later, what he had thought when he saw it. He said that his first feeling, looking at the devastation, had been something unexpected, something close to relief. Because the Japanese had attacked on a Sunday, he said, when most of the men were not at their battle stations. The casualties, as terrible as they were, could have been far worse, because the attack had been focused on the battleships and not on the fuel tanks or the repair facilities, because the carriers had not been in harbor, because the infrastructure that the fleet needed to fight and to recover was largely intact. Nimitz was not a man given to false comfort or empty optimism. He was a precise, clear-eyed, methodical commander who understood exactly what the situation was. And the situation, he judged, was serious but not hopeless. The fleet had been hurt. It had not been destroyed, and it could be rebuilt. That judgment would shape everything that followed. Let the story rest here for a moment. We have come a long way in these segments from the diplomatic tensions of the 1930s, through the planning of the attack, through the quiet of that last Saturday morning, through the attack itself, and now into the stunned and purposeful days that followed. The story has been moving through time the way large historical events move through time, slowly at first, then all at once, then slowly again as the world tries to absorb what has happened and find its footing. There is more to tell. In the segments ahead, we will follow the Pacific War as it unfolded, the early Japanese advances, the critical battles that turned the tide, the Long Island by Island campaign that carried American forces back across the ocean. We will spend time with the people who lived through it, soldiers and sailors, factory workers and nurses, civilians on both sides of the conflict. And eventually we will arrive at the ending that will bring us back, in its own way, to where we began. But that is ahead of us. Right now, in our story, it is December 1941. The harbor is still smoking. The telegrams are still arriving at front doors across America. And in recruiting offices from Maine to California, young men are standing in lines that stretch out onto the pavement, waiting to sign their names. The sleeping giant, as someone, perhaps Yamamoto himself, though the attribution is disputed, is said to have remarked, had been awakened. What that awakening would mean for the world would take 4 more years to become fully clear. It is important to spend time here, because the story of Pearl Harbor is not just a story of one Sunday morning. It is the story of what that morning set in motion, and the full meaning of what was set in motion only becomes clear when you understand what came next. The months of darkness that followed, and then, slowly, the first faint signs of light. Japan's strategy in the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor was breathtaking in its scope and, initially, in its success. The Imperial Japanese military was not simply striking at the American fleet. It was executing a carefully planned campaign to seize what its strategists called the Southern Resource Zone, a vast arc of territory stretching from Burma in the west, through Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, to the Philippines in the east. This zone contained the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the tin mines and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. Everything Japan needed to sustain its empire. Everything it had been denied by the American embargo. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. Japan was simultaneously attacking targets spread across millions of square miles of ocean in jungle and archipelago. It was taking on not just the United States but the British Empire, the Dutch government in exile, and every allied interest in the Pacific. The assumption underlying all of it was that the initial campaign would be swift enough and decisive enough that Japan could consolidate its gains before the Allies recovered their balance. For the first several months, that assumption appeared to be correct. The Philippines fell first, or rather, began to fall, in a process that would unfold over several agonizing months. The Philippines in 1941 were an American Commonwealth not yet fully independent, but on a path toward independence, and defended by a combined force of American regular troops and Filipino soldiers under command of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was one of the most complicated figures in American military history, a man of extraordinary ability and equally extraordinary ego, capable of both brilliant strategic vision and spectacular misjudgment, often within the same campaign. On December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, the same day in the Philippines due to the international date line, Japanese aircraft struck the American airfields at Clark and Iba. MacArthur had received warning of the Pearl Harbor attack hours earlier and had inexplicably failed to disperse his aircraft. They were caught on the ground, lined up in neat rows, and destroyed in almost exactly the same way as the planes at Wheeler Field in Hawaii. It was a painful repetition of the same mistake in almost the same circumstances, just hours later. The reasons for it have never been entirely satisfactorily explained. Without air cover, the defense of the Philippines was compromised from the start. Japanese ground forces landed on Luzon in December and advanced rapidly. MacArthur withdrew his forces to the Bataan Peninsula, a finger of jungle-covered land jutting into Manila Bay, and declared Manila an open city to spare it from destruction. The plan was to hold Bataan until relief arrived. Help was coming. MacArthur assured his men, "Hold on. Help is coming." It was not coming. The Pacific Fleet was in no position to run a relief convoy through Japanese-controlled waters. Washington had made the painful strategic decision that Europe was a priority, that defeating Germany first was the essential task, and that the Pacific, for the moment, would have to hold on with what it had. The men on Bataan held on. Through January and February and into March of 1942, they held on weakened by disease and malnutrition. Their rations cut again and again as supplies ran out, fighting in the suffocating heat of the jungle with inadequate ammunition and equipment against a better supplied enemy. They called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. They wrote a sardonic verse about their situation that circulated to a peninsula, something to the effect that they had no mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, and nobody give a damn. In March, under orders from Washington, MacArthur left Bataan by PT boat, slipping through Japanese lines in the night. He went to Australia, where he would command the eventual Allied counteroffensive. His departure was controversial at the time and has remained so. He left behind his men, who were running out of everything. On April 9, 1942, the largest surrender of American-led forces in the nation's history took place on the Bataan Peninsula. Somewhere between 70 and 80,000 Filipino and American soldiers laid down their arms. What followed was one of the most terrible episodes of the entire war. The Bataan Death March. The Japanese commanders had not adequately planned for the number of prisoners they took. They had expected far fewer. The men who surrendered were already severely weakened, starving, ill with malaria and dysentery and other tropical diseases, exhausted from months of fighting on inadequate rations, and they were now required to march approximately 6 to 5 miles to a prison camp in the Philippine heat. The march took place over about 12 days. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners denied food and water, beaten for falling behind, killed for stopping to rest. Men who collapsed were left where they fell, or worse. The guards varied. Some showed basic human decency, others committed acts of extreme cruelty. It was not a systematic massacre in the way that some other wartime atrocities were. It was something more complicated and in some ways more disturbing, a catastrophic failure of planning combined with a casual disregard for the lives of prisoners that reflected deep cultural attitudes about surrender that ran through parts of the Japanese military. Estimates of the death toll vary. Somewhere between 5 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers and 500 to 600 American prisoners died during the march and in the immediate aftermath. The survivors were imprisoned under conditions of severe deprivation that would claim many more lives over the following years. The Bataan Death March would become, for Americans, one of the defining atrocities of the Pacific War, a story of suffering that fueled the anger driving the American war effort through the long years ahead. Elsewhere, the news was equally grim. Hong Kong fell to Japanese forces on Christmas Day, 1941. British and Canadian and Indian troops had held out for 18 days before surrendering. Singapore, the great British naval fortress at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, regarded as an impregnable bastion of British imperial power in Asia, fell on February 15, 1942. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. A Japanese force smaller than the defending garrison had advanced down the Malay Peninsula in a matter of weeks, moving partly on bicycles through terrain the British commanders had assumed was impenetrable, and arrived at Singapore's back door. The water supply was threatened. The ammunition was running low. General Arthur Percival surrendered 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to a Japanese force perhaps a third that size. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. He was not wrong. Rangoon fell. Java fell. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil fields, were in Japanese hands by March. In the Indian Ocean, a Japanese carrier force raided Ceylon, sinking British warships and sending the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet fleeing westward. Japanese submarines appeared in the shipping lanes off the coast of California, and one briefly shelled a coastal installation in Oregon. There were serious discussions in Australia about whether a Japanese invasion of the Australian mainland was possible. The arc of Japanese advance, mapped on a chart, was extraordinary. In roughly 90 days, Japan had seized an empire stretching from Burma to the Central Pacific, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that its leaders had envisioned, won faster and more completely than almost anyone, including its architects, had dared to hope. And yet, even in those darkest months, certain things were happening that the map of Japanese victories did not show. The American industrial machine was beginning to move. Roosevelt had asked Congress for a declaration of war. He also asked for something that in some ways required an even greater act of imagination, a commitment to production on a scale that no country had ever attempted. Tens of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, hundreds of ships, the physical material of modern warfare, produced not over years but over months, in quantities that would eventually overwhelm any opponent. American industry responded with a speed and scale that astonished even its own planners. Automobile factories were converted to produce tanks and aircraft. Shipyards that had been idle during the Depression were expanded and ran around the clock. Women entered the industrial workforce in numbers that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the poster of a woman flexing her arm with the slogan "We can do it," became one of the defining images of the American home front. The conversion was not seamless. There were shortages and bottlenecks and bureaucratic tangles, but the direction was unmistakable. Every month that passed, the industrial output of the United States increased. Every month, more ships were launched, more planes rolled off the production lines, more soldiers completed their training and were ready to deploy. Japan had known this was coming. Yamamoto knew this was coming. It was precisely why he had believed that a swift, decisive blow at Pearl Harbour, a blow that might shock America into a negotiated peace, was Japan's only realistic strategic option. A prolonged war of attrition with the United States was, he understood, unwinnable. But the blow had not been decisive enough. The carriers had not been there. The fuel tanks had been left standing. And America had not sought a negotiated peace. It had declared war and begun, with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a very large country that has finally made up its mind to build the means of fighting it. There is something worth pausing on here about the nature of this particular moment in history. The outcome of the Second World War, from our vantage point, feels inevitable. We know who won. We know how it ended. And because we know, it is tempting to look back at those early months of 1942 at the fall of Singapore, the Death March on Bataan, the Japanese carriers ranging across the Indian Ocean, and see them as simply the prelude to an inevitable Allied victory. But the people living through it did not know how it would end. The men dying on Bataan did not know they would be remembered as the first chapter of a story with a victorious ending. The Australian civilians nervously watching the northern horizon did not know they were safe. The planners in Washington, looking at a map of Japanese conquest, could see the resources and the industrial capacity that gave them reason for long-term confidence, but they also knew how far away the long term was, and how much could go wrong in the meantime. History is not inevitable until it has happened. The people who made it were frightened and uncertain and often wrong, and they kept going anyway. That is perhaps the most honest and the most important thing that can be said about them. The Battle of Midway, June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. By the time we are finished with this segment, you will understand why historians consider it one of the true pivot points of the Second World War. And perhaps you will feel something of the extraordinary improbability of how it unfolded, the way that chance and courage and one crucial piece of intelligence combined to change the course of the Pacific War in the space of a single morning. To understand Midway, we need to understand the state of the Pacific in the spring of 1942. Japan's conquests were vast and, for the moment, secure. But the Japanese High Command faced a strategic problem. That success had created the problem of what to do next. The initial phase of the war had gone better than almost anyone had dared hope. But the southern resource zone, now secured, needed to be defended. And defending it meant maintaining a perimeter beyond which American and Allied forces could not be allowed to penetrate. The question was where to draw that perimeter, and how to deal with the one persistent threat that the Pearl Harbor attack had failed to eliminate. The American aircraft carriers. There were, at this point, 4 fleet carriers operating in the Pacific: the Enterprise, the Hornet, the Yorktown, and the Lexington. They had been conducting raids, hit and run attacks on Japanese-held islands, probing the edges of the new Japanese Empire, demonstrating that the Pacific Fleet was still capable of offensive action. The raids had been modest in their material effect, but they had been deeply unsettling to the Japanese High Command. And then, in April 1942, something happened that changed everything. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, flew 800 miles across the Pacific and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid, as it came to be known, caused minimal physical damage. The bombs fell on a city that was largely unprepared, and the fires they started were quickly controlled. The planes could not land back on the carrier. They flew on to China, where most of the crew survived, some after extraordinary adventures. In strictly military terms, the raid was a minor episode, but its psychological effect was enormous on both sides. For Americans and for the Allied corps generally, the raid was electrifying. Tokyo had been bombed. The Japanese home islands, which the Japanese people had been told was safely beyond the reach of any enemy, had been struck. It was a demonstration that the initiative was not entirely Japan's, that America was still capable of reaching out across the ocean and striking back. For the Japanese military leadership, the raid was deeply alarming for precisely the same reasons. If American aircraft could reach Tokyo, the safety of the home islands could not be taken for granted. The defensive perimeter needed to be extended. The American carriers wherever they were needed to be found and destroyed. This imperative drove the decision that led to Midway. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was, in its broad outline, elegant. He would use Midway Atoll, a tiny American-held island roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, as bait. The Japanese would threaten to invade and occupy Midway. The Americans would have to respond. They could not allow Japan to establish a base that close to Hawaii. And when the American carriers came out to defend Midway, Yamamoto's waiting fleet would destroy them. It was a reasonable plan. It had worked, in principle, before luring an enemy fleet to a position where it could be destroyed at a time and place of your choosing was one of the oldest stratagems in naval warfare. What Yamamoto did not know was that the Americans had been reading his mail. In a basement office at Pearl Harbor, in a unit that was officially designated Combat Intelligence Unit but was known to those who worked there as Station Hypo, a group of American cryptanalysts had been working for months on the Japanese naval code for a complex cipher system designated JN-25. The work was painstaking. Codes are, by design, resistant to analysis. The Japanese cipher was changed periodically, requiring the analyst to start portions of their work over from the beginning. The amount of encrypted traffic they had to work with was vast, and most of it was routine administrative traffic with no intelligence value. But gradually, patiently, the team led by Commander Joseph Rushford, an eccentric, brilliant officer who was known to work in a bathrobe and preferred the basement to daylight, had made progress. By the spring of 1942, they could read significant portions of Japanese naval communications. Not everything, not always in real time, but enough. And what they were reading, in April and May of 1942, pointed strongly toward a major Japanese operation. An operation directed against a target that the Japanese messages referred to only as AF. The question was what AF was. Most analysts in Washington believed it referred to the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. Rushford was convinced it was Midway. To confirm his theory, he proposed a simple and rather beautiful ruse. He arranged for the American base at Midway to broadcast, in a low-level unencrypted code that Japanese intelligence was known to monitor, a message reporting that Midway's water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running short of fresh water. Shortly afterward, Japanese naval traffic began referring to a water shortage at AF. Rushford was right. AF was Midway. The target was confirmed. The timing in early June was known. The approximate composition of the Japanese strike force could be estimated from the traffic, and most crucially, the general direction and sequence of the Japanese approach could be determined. For the first time since the war began, the Americans would not be reacting to Japanese moves. They would be waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Fleet commander, had 3 carriers available. The Enterprise and the Hornet were operational. The Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. In early May, a battle that had itself been possible only because of code-breaking intelligence, and which had ended in an American tactical defeat, but a strategic success, turning back a Japanese invasion force aimed at Port Moresby in New Guinea. When the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor after Coral Sea, damage assessors told Nimitz it would take 3 months to repair her. Nimitz told him he needed her in 3 days. Pearl Harbor's repair crews worked around the clock. 1,400 men swarmed over the carrier. They worked in shifts without stopping, welding and patching and replacing damaged equipment. In 72 hours, 3 days, exactly as Nimitz had demanded, the Yorktown was back at sea. Not perfect, not fully repaired, but operational. Able to fly aircraft, able to fight. It was, in its quiet way, one of the remarkable feats of the entire war, a demonstration that the repair facilities that the Japanese had left untouched at Pearl Harbor, the facilities that a third strike wave might have destroyed, were functioning, effective, and capable of things that should not have been possible. The 3 American carriers headed northwest, toward Midway, to the positions Nimitz had assigned them northeast of the atoll, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance, waiting. The Japanese strike force approached from the northwest on the night of June 3rd and into the morning of June 4th, 1942. It was an enormous fleet. 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Sarayu, and the Hiryu, veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, carrying between them more than 250 aircraft, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, a transport fleet following behind, carrying the invasion troops from Midway, and further back, Yamamoto himself on his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with a massive surface force in reserve. Against this, the Americans had 3 carriers, no battleships, and the small garrison and air force on Midway Island itself. On paper, it was not a contest, but paper does not capture everything. In the early morning of June 4th, the Japanese launched their first strike over 100 aircraft heading toward Midway to neutralize its defenses before the invasion. American radar on the island detected them early. American fighters rose to meet them and were largely swept aside. The Japanese aircraft were better, and the American pilots defending Midway were outmatched. The island was bombed heavily, but it was not knocked out. The Japanese strike commander, returning to the carriers and assessing the damage, radioed back that a second strike on Midway would be necessary before the island could be invaded. That message set off a chain of decisions aboard the Japanese carriers that would ultimately prove fatal. The Japanese carriers had been holding a reserve of aircraft armed with torpedoes ready to strike at any American ships that might appear. Now, given the recommendation for a second Midway strike, Admiral Nagumo ordered those aircraft rearmed. The torpedoes were removed. Land attack bombs were fitted in their place. It was a major undertaking. Changing an aircraft weapons loadout takes time. The old weapons must be unloaded, moved, stored, and the new weapons brought up and fitted. The carrier flight decks and hangars filled with activity, with aircraft in various states of rearming, with torpedoes and bombs being moved on trolleys through the crowded below-deck spaces. And then, at the worst possible moment, an American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet and sent its report. American surface ships. Carriers. To the northeast. Nagumo received a report and faced a sudden, agonizing reversal. He needed to rearm the aircraft again back to torpedoes, back to ship-killing weapons. The rearming operation was reversed. Torpedoes were brought back up. Bombs were set aside, not carefully stowed in the magazines, as proper procedure required, but left on the hangar decks, where they were faster to access but enormously dangerous in the event of fire or explosion. Time was the enemy. The first strike wave was returning from Midway and needed to land. The second strike wave was not ready. The carriers were crowded and vulnerable, their decks cluttered, their magazines in a state of dangerous flux. Nagumo decided to wait to recover his returning aircraft, complete the rearming, and then launch a coordinated, full-strength strike against the American carriers. It was a reasonable decision under the circumstances. It was also the decision that lost the battle. The American attack came in 3 waves, and the first 2 were disasters. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the Hornet, found the Japanese fleet in attack without fighter escort, in slow, lumbering aircraft that the Japanese Zeros tore apart with almost contemptuous ease. All 15 planes were shot down. Of their 30 crewmen, 1 survived, Ensign George Gay, who floated in the ocean for hours, watching the battle unfold around him from the water. The other torpedo squadrons fared similarly. They pressed their attacks with extraordinary courage, knowing they were flying into overwhelming opposition, knowing their chances of survival were desperately small. They achieved almost nothing in material terms. They lost most of their planes and most of their men, but they did something else. Something that could not have been planned and could not have been predicted. The Zeros that destroyed the torpedo planes had been drawn down low down from their high-altitude patrol positions, down to the wave-top level where the torpedo attacks had been coming in. The Japanese combat air patrol was low and occupied and temporarily disorganized. The carriers below them were in the middle of rearming operations, their decks crowded, their defenses momentarily distracted. And at that precise moment, at the exact worst moment for the Japanese and the exact best moment for the Americans, the dive bombers arrived. 37 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and 17 more from the Yorktown came down from high altitude in nearly vertical dives, targeting the Japanese carriers below them. The attack lasted approximately 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soraya, were hit by multiple bombs and set catastrophically ablaze. The bombs penetrated to the hangar decks, where the partially rearmed aircraft sat fueled and loaded, where the torpedoes and bombs that had been hastily set aside during the rearming reversal were stacked and unsecured. The explosions triggered secondary explosions. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by 2 bombs and began to burn. The Kaga was hit by 4 bombs and was quickly an inferno. The Soraya was hit by 3 bombs and sank before nightfall. 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, were mortally wounded in 5 minutes. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial attack and immediately launched a counterstrike that found and badly damaged the Yorktown. But the Hiryu herself was found later that afternoon by American dive bombers and set on fire. She sank the following morning. By the evening of June 4th, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. 322 Japanese aircraft had been lost. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had been killed, including many of the most experienced naval aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy, men whose training and skill could not easily be replaced. The Americans had lost the Yorktown, sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later while under tow, and 147 aircraft. 307 Americans had been killed. It was the most decisive naval victory in American history, and it had been achieved by a smaller force through a combination of intelligence, improvisation, and the kind of courage that shows itself in men pressing an attack they know is almost certainly fatal. The Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War. There were 3 more years of brutal fighting ahead, island by island, mile by mile, at enormous cost to both sides. We will touch on some of that in the segments that follow. But Midway changed the fundamental character of the war. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative. It could choose where to strike, when to move, how to extend its empire. After Midway, Japan was on the defensive. Its carrier air power had been broken. Its most experienced aviators were gone and could not be replaced quickly enough. The industrial gap between Japan and the United States, the gap that Yamamoto had always understood and always feared, would now assert itself with increasing force. Every month, American shipyards launched new carriers. Every month, American training programs produced new pilots. Every month, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted a little further, and then a little further still. Japan could not match this. It had never been able to match this, and its leadership had known it. The strategy of the swift, decisive blow that would shock America into a settlement had failed. And now the long war that Yamamoto had feared was exactly what Japan faced. There is a quality to this battle that I find worth sitting with, even quietly, even briefly, before we rest. The men who flew the torpedo attacks, the men of Torpedo Squadron 8 and the other torpedo squadrons who were destroyed in those first hours, did not know, as they flew toward the Japanese fleet, that their sacrifice was about to make the dive bomb attack possible. They did not know they were drawing the Zeros down low. They could not have known. They simply flew into an overwhelming force because they had been ordered to, and because the men around them were flying too, and because that is what you do. And the dive bomber pilots, when they arrived above the Japanese carriers, found the sky above them clear and the carriers below them vulnerable and exposed in a way that should not have been possible, in a way that no planning could have arranged, in a way that depended on the deaths of the men who had gone before them. History, at certain moments, turns on things like this, on the intersection of sacrifice and timing and chance that produces an outcome no one could have designed. The torpedo pilots did not win the Battle of Midway, but without them, it is far from certain that the Battle of Midway would have been won. Remember them, in whatever quiet way feels right to you. The name meant nothing to most Americans before August 1942. It was a large island in the southwestern Pacific, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered almost entirely in dense tropical jungle, threaded with rivers, and home to a population of indigenous Melanesian people who watched the great powers fight over their island with a mixture of bewilderment and pragmatic adaptability. American military planners had not originally intended to make Guadalcanal a priority, but in July 1942, reconnaissance aircraft reported that Japanese forces on the island had begun constructing an airfield. An airfield on Guadalcanal would give Japan a base from which to threaten the supply lines between the United States and Australia, the lifeline that kept Australia in the war and that any future Allied offensive in the Pacific would depend upon. The decision was made to take the island before the airfield could be completed. And on August 7th, 1942, exactly 8 months after Pearl Harbour, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. It was America's first major offensive ground operation of the Pacific War. And from the very beginning, almost nothing went according to plan. The Marines took the airfield on the first day. The Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle, leaving their equipment behind. The Americans renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, and immediately set about making it operational. What followed was 6 months of fighting for control of that airfield and the island around it, fighting on land, at sea, and in the air, simultaneously and continuously, in conditions of extraordinary difficulty. The jungle on Guadalcanal was unlike anything most of the Marines had trained for. Dense, dark, dripping with moisture, cut by ridges and ravines that made navigation nearly impossible and turned every advance into an exhausting ordeal. The heat were crushing temperatures in the 90s, combined with humidity that left men perpetually soaked in sweat. Disease was everywhere. Malaria, dysentery, fungal infections, a debilitating illness called jungle rot that ate at men's skin. At the height of the campaign, it was estimated that the majority of American troops on the island were sick in some degree, fighting through fever and nausea and weakness that would have put them in a hospital anywhere else in the world. The food was inadequate. The supply situation was precarious. Japanese air and naval forces made it dangerous for American ships to remain near the island during daylight hours, and much of the resupply work had to be done at night, quickly, under fire, with no guarantee that what was landed would actually reach the men who needed it. And the Japanese, rather than accepting the loss of the island, committed to retaking it. They sent reinforcements down through the island chain to the northwest, a passage that American sailors came to call the Slot, and the Japanese resupply runs that came down it at night they called the Tokyo Express. Night after night, Japanese destroyers raced down the Slot, landed troops and supplies, and raced back before daylight brought American air power to bear. The sea battles around Guadalcanal were some of the most intense of the entire war. There were 7 major naval engagements around the island between August and November 1942 alone. The waters around Guadalcanal became so thick with sunken ships, American and Japanese both, that sailors called it Iron Bottom Sound. It is still called that today. The wrecks are still there, resting on the bottom in the blue water. Let me tell you about one night in that campaign, not to dwell on the violence of it, but because it captures something essential about what the men on Guadalcanal endured and how they endured it. The night of October 13th, 1942, the Japanese had assembled 2 of their largest battleships, the Congo and the Haruna, and sent them down the Slot to bombard Henderson Field. Battleships carry enormous guns. Their shells are the size of small cars, and they arrive without warning. And the sound they make when they detonate is not really a sound at all. It is a physical force, a pressure that you feel in your chest and your teeth and your bones before you hear anything. For 90 minutes that night, the 2 battleships fired nearly 1,000 shells at Henderson Field and the surrounding area. The Marines and sailors on the island had almost no warning and no way to respond. They could only dig into their foxholes and hold on and wait for it to stop. By morning, most of the aircraft at Henderson Field had been destroyed. The runway was cratered. Fuel and ammunition dumps were burning. 41 men had been killed. Hundreds more were wounded. The men who survived described the night in terms that suggested something beyond ordinary fear, kind of dissolution, a stripping away of everything except the bare fact of being alive. And then, the next morning, the survivors got up. They filled in the craters with whatever they had. They patched the aircraft that could be patched. They scrounged fuel from drums that had survived the bombardment, and they kept the airfield running. Because that was the job. Keep the airfield running. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not all cut from some special heroic cloth. They were young men from everywhere in America, from farms and cities and small towns, from backgrounds of every kind. Many of them had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, motivated by the same surge of anger and purpose that had filled the recruiting offices in December 1941. Others had been in the Marines before the war and had simply found themselves, through the logic of military assignment, on this particular island at this particular time. They were, in the main, extraordinarily ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And the thing that stands out most, reading their accounts and their letters and the memoirs they wrote later, is not heroism in the theatrical sense, not dramatic charges and stirring speeches, but something quieter and more durable. Endurance. The capacity to keep going when nothing about the situation gave any obvious reason to keep going. To do the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that, and not think too far ahead. One Marine who fought on Guadalcanal, interviewed decades later, was asked what had kept him going through the worst of it. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said that mostly you didn't think about grand things. You thought about your foxhole buddy. You made sure he was okay. He made sure you were okay. That was mostly what it was. That was mostly what it was. By February 1943, after 6 months of fighting, the Japanese had had enough of Guadalcanal. In a feat of considerable operational skill, they evacuated their remaining forces from the island over 3 nights, nearly 11,000 men, quietly removed under cover of darkness, without the Americans realizing until the evacuation was complete. It was one of the more remarkable retreats of the war. The men evacuated were exhausted and ill and diminished, but they were alive, and the Japanese High Command, which had expected a quick reconquest of the island and had instead found itself in a 6-month attritional battle that it could not win, had finally accepted the loss. Guadalcanal was secure. Henderson Field was secure. The supply line to Australia was secure. The road back across the Pacific had begun, but there was still a very long way to go. The strategy that General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz developed for the rest of the Pacific War was called island hopping, though the men who executed it sometimes used less polite names for it. The idea was not to try to recapture every island the Japanese held, which would take a lifetime and cost an incalculable number of lives. Instead, the Allies would select specific islands as stepping stones, seize them, build airfields and supply bases, and move forward, leaving the Japanese garrisons on the bypassed islands to wither and starve, cut off from resupply, slowly and grimly irrelevant to a war that had moved past them. It was a sound strategy. It saved many lives that a more comprehensive campaign would have cost. But the islands that were chosen for assault were often fiercely defended, and the battles to them became bywords for a particular kind of combat intensity that has few equivalents in military history. Tarawa, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, taken in November 1943 in 76 hours of fighting so intense that nearly 1,000 Americans were killed, taking an island roughly the size of City Park. The photograph from Tarawa, the bodies of Marines in the surf, the wreckage of landing craft, The churn coral of the beach shocked the American public when they were released and provoked a national conversation about whether the reality of the war was being adequately communicated to people at home. Peleliu, an island that military planners expected to fall in 4 days. It took more than 2 months. Nearly 2,000 Americans were killed. The Japanese defenders fought from an elaborate network of tunnels and cave fortifications that proved almost impossible to reduce by conventional assault. The battle accomplished relatively little of strategic significance. It is remembered today partly as one of the most costly battles of the Pacific War, and partly as a cautionary tale about the difference between planning and reality. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, dominated by a dormant volcano called Mount Suribachi, whose capture was deemed essential because it lay on the flight path between the Mariana Islands where American B-29 bombers were based and the Japanese home islands. 22,000 Japanese defenders dug into volcanic rock in fortifications so deep that bombing had almost no effect on them. 6,800 Americans killed. 26,000 wounded. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in one of the most famous photographs in American history, took place on the 5th day of a battle that lasted 36. Each island was its own world. Each had its own particular horror and its own particular acts of courage. And the men who fought through them carried those islands with them for the rest of their lives, in ways that were not always easy to talk about and not always easy to put down. And while all of this was happening on the islands of the Pacific, another war was being fought, a different kind of war, quieter and less dramatic, but no less important on the home fronts of both America and Japan. In America, the home front hummed with productive energy. The factories ran around the clock. By 1944, the United States were producing more aircraft per month than Japan produced in a year. Shipyards were launching aircraft carriers, the fast carriers of the Essex class, the most capable warships of their era at a rate that would have seemed impossible in 1941. The industrial gap that Yamamoto had feared was now a chasm, growing wider every month. Rationing was in effect. Sugar, meat, butter, gasoline, rubber ore were controlled, allocated, directed toward the war effort. Americans planted victory gardens in their backyards. They saved cooking fat and turned it into collection points. They bought war bonds. They wrote letters to men overseas and received back letters that said as much in what they did not say as in what they did, because censors removed anything that might reveal locations, operations, leaving behind the human essentials. I am alive. I am thinking of you. I hope this reaches you. But the American home front was not simply a story of unity and shared sacrifice. The internment of Japanese Americans, 120,000 people, the majority of them American citizens, forcibly removed from their homes and confined in camps in the interior of the country on the basis of their ancestry alone, was carried out in 1942 with the support of public opinion and the approval of the Supreme Court in a ruling that has since been widely recognized as one of the great legal failures in American history. It was a profound injustice, and it was carried out at the same time that Japanese American soldiers, the men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and other units, were fighting in Europe with a distinction and ferocity that earned them more decorations than almost any other unit in the American military. They were fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. They fought anyway. History does not offer clean stories. The best it offers is honest ones. In Japan, the home front was a different kind of experience entirely. As the war turned against Japan, the civilian population was subjected to increasing hardship, shortages of food and fuel and basic goods, a propaganda environment that made it difficult to know how the war was actually going, and the growing, terrible awareness, which could not be spoken aloud, that things were not proceeding as the government had promised they would. Japanese civilians had been told, in 1941, that the war in the Pacific would be swift and victorious. They had been told of the attack on Pearl Harbour with enormous pride, a great blow struck against the arrogance of the Western powers, a declaration that Japan would not be dictated to, that Asia would be shaped by Asians. By 1944, the reality was becoming harder to conceal. Islands were being lost. Ships were being sunk. The young men who had gone off to war were not coming back, or were coming back diminished, or were simply not coming back and not being spoken of. The official news grew increasingly vague and increasingly difficult to believe. And from the autumn of 1944, something new began. The B-29 bomber's enormous aircraft, the largest of the war, flying from the newly captured Mariana Islands, began appearing over the Japanese home islands. At first they came in small numbers and high altitude, and their bombing was imprecise. But over the winter of 1944 and into 1945, the raid grew more frequent and more devastating. The Japanese civilians who watched the B-29's overhead knew, even if they could not say it, what the planes meant. The sleeping giant that had been awakened at Pearl Harbor had crossed the ocean. It was overhead in the dark sky above Japan. We are getting close now to the end of the story. In the next segment, we will arrive at 1945, the final year of the war, the decisions that ended it, and the complicated, difficult, necessary reckoning with what those decisions meant and still mean. But before we go there, I want to pause here at roughly the midpoint of the Pacific War and simply acknowledge the human scale of what we have been talking about. Numbers lose their meaning when they become large enough. Thousands of aircraft, thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of casualties. The mind cannot really hold those figures in the way it can hold a single person, a single story. So perhaps it is worth remembering, as we move through this history, that every number in it was once a person. Someone who woke up on ordinary mornings and thought about ordinary things. Someone who was loved by someone, and who loved someone back. Someone for whom the war was not a chapter in a history book, but the whole world, pressing in from every direction, demanding things that no one should be asked to give. They gave them anyway, on both sides, in conditions that we cannot really imagine from our comfortable distance. They endured what they had to endure, and most of them, remarkably, retained enough of themselves afterward to come home and build lives and raise children and grow old and tell their stories, or not tell them, as they chose. That seems worth remembering on a quiet night like this one. By the beginning of 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer genuinely in doubt. Japan had lost its carrier air power at Midway and in the battles that followed. Its merchant shipping, the lifeline that connected the home islands to the resources of the empire it had seized, was being systematically destroyed by American submarines, which had become, by 1944 and 1945, devastatingly effective. Food and fuel and raw materials were not reaching Japan in anything like the quantities needed to sustain either the war effort or the civilian population. The economy was contracting. The military was running out of everything, and yet Japan fought on. The reasons for this are complex, and they matter for understanding what 1945 became. Part of it was ideology, the particular, deep-rooted culture of the Japanese military, in which surrender was not simply defeat but dishonor of the most profound kind. Officers who had been captured sometimes killed themselves rather than face the shame of being taken prisoner. Soldiers on bypassed islands, cut off from supply and reinforcement for months or years, sometimes continued to resist because they had never been formally informed that the war was over, and it would not have been in their nature to stop simply because their situation were hopeless. The famous case of Hio Onodo, a Japanese soldier who kept fighting in the Philippine jungle until 1974, when his original commanding officer was flown in to formally relieve him of duty, is an extreme example of something that was not in the culture of the Imperial Japanese military, as extreme as it might seem. Part of it was rational military calculation. Japan still had significant forces on the home islands. It still had kamikaze aircraft flown by pilots who had volunteered, or been assigned, to crash their aircraft directly into American ships, trading their lives for damage to the enemy fleet. The kamikaze campaign had begun in late 1944 and had proven devastatingly more effective, by some measures, than conventional air attacks. American ships were being sunk and damaged at a rate that was deeply alarming to naval planners. And part of it was the nature of the Japanese government in those final months, a government paralyzed between factions, some of which understood that the war was lost and sought a negotiated end, and others of which believed that one more blow, one more demonstration of Japanese resolve, might change the calculus enough to win better terms. The two factions pulled in opposite directions, and the result was a kind of terrible inertia, an inability to stop even as everything pointed toward the necessity of stopping. The American campaign against Japan in 1945 operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At sea, the submarine blockade tightened. Shipping losses were catastrophic for Japan. By early 1945, the flow of oil from the Dutch East Indies, the resources of the entire Pacific War had been launched to secure, had been reduced to a trickle. In the air, the B-29 campaign intensified. The early high-altitude precision bombing raids had been disappointing. The jet stream over Japan disrupted formations and made accurate bombing nearly impossible. In March 1945, General Curtis LeMay made a decision that changed the character of the air campaign fundamentally. He ordered his bombers to fly at night, at low altitude, carrying incendiary bombs rather than high explosives. Japan's cities were built largely of wood. Incendiary bombs, in sufficient quantities, could start fires that would spread faster than they could be controlled. And on the night of March 9th, 1945, 334 B-29s flew over Tokyo and dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on the most densely populated city on Earth. The resulting firestorm killed somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people. The estimates vary and may never be precise. It destroyed 16 square miles of the city. It left 1 million people homeless. It was, by some measures, the single most destructive conventional air raid in history, more deadly in a single night than any other bombing attack of the war. And it was followed by more raids. On Nagoya, on Osaka, on Kobe, on 6 to 7 Japanese cities over the following months, in a campaign that was systematic and deliberate and that, by the summer of 1945, had reduced much of urban Japan to ash and rubble. The people who died in these raids were not soldiers. They were civilians, factory workers and shopkeepers and children and elderly men and women who had lived through years of war and privation, and who now found themselves in the path of something that offered no shelter and no escape. They had not asked for the war that their government had launched. They could not stop it. They burned anyway. This is a fact of the bombing campaign that demands to be stated plainly, even especially in a narrative that is primarily told from the American perspective. Civilian suffering was not an accident or a regrettable side effect of the air campaign. By 1945 it had become, with deliberate strategic intent, the campaign itself. The goal was to break Japan's will to continue fighting by making the cost of continuation unbearable. Whether it was morally justified, whether the logic of ending a devastating war more quickly can justify the deliberate killing of civilians is one of the central ethical questions of the 20th century. It does not have a clean answer. People who have thought carefully about it for 80 years have reached different conclusions. What can be said is that it cannot be waved away. The people who died in the firebombing of Tokyo deserve the same acknowledgement as the people who died at Pearl Harbour, or on the Bataan Death March, or on the beaches of Guadalcanal. They were people. They died in terrible circumstances. Their deaths matter. On the ground, the final island campaigns were reaching their bloody conclusions. Okinawa, a large island less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands, was invaded by American forces on April 1st, 1945. It was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, and it became the longest and most costly battle of the entire campaign. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was conducted with a deliberateness and a sophistication born of the knowledge that this was the last line before the home islands themselves. Enormous fortifications had been constructed in the southern part of the island. The defenders, under General Mitsuru Oshijima, fought from cave systems and tunnel networks in a way designed to maximize American casualties trading space for lives, forcing the Americans to dig them out yard by yard, knowing that every American soldier and Marine killed on Okinawa was an argument against the inevitable invasion of Japan itself. The kamikaze attacks on the American fleet offshore were the most intense of the entire war. Nearly 2,000 kamikaze missions were flown during the Okinawa campaign. 36 American ships were sunk. Hundreds more were damaged. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, more naval casualties than in any other battle of the Pacific War. On the island itself, the fighting lasted 8 to 2 days. 12,000 Americans were killed or missing. Approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers died, the vast majority in combat, some in a final, hopeless banzai charge when their position became untenable. And the Okinawan civilians, the people who actually lived on this island that two foreign powers were fighting over, suffered terribly. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 40 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died in the battle, some killed in the crossfire, others by Japanese soldiers who forced them from caves that were needed as defensive positions, others in mass suicides that the Japanese military had, in some documented cases, encouraged or compelled. By the time Okinawa was secured, in late June 1945, the American military planners responsible for planning the invasion of the Japanese home islands had revised their casualty estimates upward significantly and repeatedly. The invasion of Japan Operation Downfall, as it was called, was planned for November 1945. It was to begin with an assault on the southernmost of the main Japanese islands, Kyushu, involving hundreds of thousands of American troops and the largest naval force ever assembled. The estimates of casualties, American and Japanese, civilian and military, varied enormously depending on assumptions about resistance. Some estimates ran into the hundreds of thousands. Some ran higher. The Japanese military had correctly predicted the likely invasion beaches and had concentrated enormous forces and thousands more kamikaze aircraft in Kyushu in preparation. It was against this backdrop the firebombing campaign, the Okinawa casualties, the projected cost of an invasion that the decision was made to use a new weapon. The atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, the American program to develop an atomic weapon, had begun in 1942 and had consumed 3 years and $2 billion and the labor of some of the finest scientific minds in the world. It had succeeded. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic device was detonated in the New Mexico desert in a test code-named Trinity. The explosion was visible for 200 miles. The light was described by those present as brighter than the sun. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the project, watching the fireball rise from the desert, recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death." The line reads, "the destroyer of worlds." President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, and who had only learned of the atomic bomb program after becoming president, received confirmation of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany with Churchill and Stalin. He authorized the use of the weapon against Japan. The decision has been debated ever since. Those who defend it point to the invasion casualty projections, to the hundreds of thousands of lives, American and Japanese, that they argue would have been lost in an invasion of the home islands. They point to the existing bombing campaign, which was already killing Japanese civilians at an enormous scale. They argue that the atomic bomb ended the war faster than any alternative, and that a faster end, however terrible its means, saved more lives than it cost. Those who question it point to evidence that Japan was already exploring surrender through back channels, particularly through the Soviet Union. They note that the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, which occurred on August 8, 2 days after Hiroshima, may have been as significant a shock to the Japanese government as the atomic bombs. They ask whether a demonstration of the weapon on an uninhabited target might have achieved the same effect. They note that the decision to target cities to maximize civilian casualties as a means of psychological impact was a moral choice, not a military necessity, and that moral choices of that magnitude deserve sustained ethical scrutiny. Both sets of arguments contain genuine truths. Neither fully resolves the question, and the people on both sides of the debate are, in the main, not arguing about whether civilian deaths are acceptable in principle. They are not, but about the impossible arithmetic of catastrophic choices in the context of a war that had already killed tens of millions of people. I will not tell you what to think about it. I am not sure anyone can tell you what to think about it. What I will say is that it deserves to be thought about. It is one of those questions that humanity acquired in 1945 and has never quite been able to put down. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped a single atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at approximately 2,000 feet above the city center. The temperature at the point of detonation reached several thousand degrees. Everything within roughly a mile of the detonation point was either vaporized or set on fire. The shockwave flattened buildings for miles in every direction. A firestorm followed. Between 70 and 80,000 people died in the initial blast and its immediate aftermath. By the end of 1945, with deaths from radiation sickness and injuries included, the toll had risen to somewhere between 90,000 and 160,000. The estimates vary because many of the victims left no trace. They were simply gone. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Nagasaki had not been the primary target that day. Cloud cover over the original target, the city of Kokura, had caused the crew to divert. Somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people died. On August 8, between the two bombs, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and immediately invaded Japanese-held Manchuria, overrunning the Kwantung Army once Japan's finest with stunning speed. Within the Japanese government, the balance between the factions finally shifted. Emperor Hirohito, whose role in the war remains a subject of historical debate, intervened directly in something that was, in the protocols of the Japanese imperial system, almost without precedent. He recorded a speech to be broadcast to the Japanese people on August 15th, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Allied surrender terms. The night before the broadcast, a group of junior military officers attempted a coup to prevent the surrender. They searched the imperial palace for the recording. They did not find it. The coup collapsed, and on the morning of August 15th, 1945, the people of Japan gathered around their radios and heard their emperor's voice for the first time, the divine voice, speaking to them directly in the formal classical Japanese of the court, telling them that the war had ended. Many of them wept, some from relief, some from grief, some, perhaps, from the complicated mixture of emotions that come when something you have believed in with your whole self turns out to have been leading somewhere terrible, and you have to find a way to live in the new world that follows. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General MacArthur presided. Representatives of the Allied powers signed the surrender documents. Then the Japanese representatives signed. Among the Allied representatives present was Admiral Chester Nimitz, who signed on behalf of the United States. And somewhere in the background, if you had looked carefully, you would have found as a witness of the ceremony brought there at Nimitz' personal invitation a handful of survivors of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The circle, very nearly, had closed, and Yamamoto, the man who had planned the attack, who had warned that waking the sleeping giant might prove fatal, who had understood what a prolonged war with America would mean, and had launched one anyway. He did not see the end of the war he had started. In April 1943, American code breakers intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's travel itinerary, a tour of forward bases in the Pacific. 16 American P-38 fighters were dispatched on a mission of extraordinary precision, flying hundreds of miles at low altitude to avoid radar, timed to intercept Yamamoto's aircraft at a specific point on his journey. They found him exactly where the intelligence said he would be, shot down his transport aircraft over the jungle of Bougainville, and killed him. He was 60 years old. He was found in the wreckage, still seated in his chair, still in his white naval uniform. He was given a state funeral in Tokyo, the streets lined with mourners, flags at half-mast. He had been right about almost everything, about American industrial power, about the folly of a prolonged war, about the impossibility of defeating the United States in the long run. Right about all of it, and unable for reasons that were as much cultural and political as personal to translate that understanding into a different choice. History is full of people like that. People who see clearly and act anyway, because the forces around them are stronger than their clarity. It does not absolve them of responsibility, but it makes them, perhaps, more comprehensible, more human. Rest here for a moment. Breathe. We have come a very long way tonight. From the drawing rooms of Tokyo in the 1930s to the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay in 1945. From the radar screens on Oahu to the skies over Hiroshima. From the band competition aboard the Arizona on a Saturday afternoon to the Emperor's voice on the radio on a summer morning, telling his people that it was over. There is one more segment, a short one that will close the story properly. It will bring us back to Pearl Harbor itself, to the harbor as it is today, and to what we carry forward from all of this. But for tonight, let what you have heard settle. Let it find its place. It is a lot to hold the scope of it, the human cost of it, the moral weight of some of its moments. You do not need to resolve any of it tonight. You just need to hold it the way history asks us to hold it, with honesty and with care and without looking away. The night is quiet. The world is still. And you have listened well. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep now. Good night.